All right, guys, we're back with our Seeing Through Gebser series. We are finishing up our discussion on sociology and economics. Thank you guys for sticking it out with me and getting so deep into this with me. We are on page 433, so we are really in the we're reaching the home stretch there to an extent at least. So there'll definitely be more videos, but we're getting there. We're getting there slowly but surely. So I'll just pick up where we left off last time, and we'll just keep doing what we've been doing. Now, when I was I like to pre-read this because if for no other reason, it's more conducive to higher quality lectures. Unfortunately, when I was doing this, my daughter woke up, which really wasn't unfortunate, which means I got to spend some time with her. So it was actually fortunate, but that means I was only able to pre-read about half of this. So the first half is going to be that, and then the second half, we're going to freestyle. So we'll see. We'll pick up where we left off, and now we're going to talk about Frobenius and his cultural spheres, to an extent at least. From a sociological view, the same holds true for modern ethnology, above all Frobenius' theory of cultural spheres. This has had a most enduring influence, and from it Frobenius develops his morphology of cultures. It would seem that its elaboration in recent years at the hands of his students has changed it from mere Gestalt theory into a theory of structure. It has been epoch-making for our estimation of alien, so-called primitive cultures. So I think what Frobenius is doing is something very similar to what Gebser is doing, and something very similar to even what maybe an Oswald Spengler is doing. This idea that cultures have their own spheres, and essentially the sphere is more or less a consciousness structure. So when he talks about the primitive cultures, when he talks about that cultural sphere, what he's essentially trying to do is describe the magic structure without describing the magic structure directly, if that makes sense. It's very important because what these cultural spheres do is they get you out of the purely rational, of only taking seriously the rational and treating everything else outside of that. One cultural sphere might be a rational American Western individual. Another cultural sphere might be a primitive, how does Gebser describe it? Not mentally accentuated culture. It's very important, and I think it ties into Spengler, because Spengler also has this understanding of, no, just because it's not rational doesn't mean it's not important, and we can still understand it through a rationality, and it needs to be respected. It needs to be respected and taken seriously when we talk about civilization cycles. It removed the mental rational presuppositions and enabled the continuously deeper penetration into the alien forms of realization and reality, and justifiably placed into doubt the sole validity of our form of reality, the mental, of course. The cultural morphology of Frobenius has added decisively to our recent ability to perceive the uniquely human, as well as the reality of mankind as multifariously structured and not dualistically divided. Beautiful. We're obviously multifariously structured, as is evident by the consciousness structures. Frobenius' theory was no doubt partially responsible for the leap into the irrational attitude. In any case, the dualistic attitude, which has contrasted the cultivated, the European, with the primitive, of lesser value, was surpassed by Frobenius' theory of cultural spheres. The consequence of this deed can hardly be overestimated, since it freed the path to an attitude encompassing all of mankind. All of these partially attempted and partially achieved rejections of rational dualism bring us to 3, the tendency toward irrationality in the new sociology. So what we're going to be talking about a lot is how, in the same way that irrationality allows us to perceive the interconnections of the structures, well, irrationality is going to allow us to perceive the interconnections of sociology, ones that are hidden from purely rational thought. Basically, it should be noted that the demonstration of the various consciousness structures carried out in the first part of this book is in itself an irrational realization. So, explaining the magic structure on its own terms, and the mythical structure and the mental and all that, that is an irrational realization. That we are not being rational. We're packaging it and delivering it rationally because we need to. We need to meet people where they are. We are not being rational. We're being irrational. The human being as a whole is multifariously structured. Since we are today in a position to survey the entire mental rational structure without confusing it with the irrational or the pre-rational, it ought to be evident that at least potentially we have achieved an overdetermined structure we have called arational, whose essence is to consciously integrate all other structures. So that's what arationality does. Of course, it integrates all other structures. And by well, you already know, recognizing the simultaneous presence and efficacy of all the structures and sort of working with the grain. Is this a time to be mythical? Is this a time to be mental? Let's see. The multifarious structure of reality is also the point of departure of Walter Tritsch, who further emphasizes the qualitative aspect and also stresses the structure of the possible. Together with A. Morau, A. Varagnik, and A. J. Toynbee, of course Arnold Toynbee, Tritsch proposed a unanimously accepted resolution that was declared mandatory by the Commission de Coordination des Sciences Historiques of the Centre Européen de la Culture in Geneva. Ooh, that was pretty good. It demands that every historian, pedagogue, and sociologist respect, quote, the distinction of three mainstreams in the events of humanity. A, the material. B, the social. C, the spiritual. Although they superimpose and mutually influence one another, not one of them is a singular determinant of the other. So it is not that the material causes the social, and the social causes the spiritual, and the spiritual causes the material. It's not that, okay? We are done with the either or one or the other crap. It's nonsense. The subjective method of making mutually acceptable distinctions can bring an end to false alternatives in research and instruction, and to redundant conflicts prevalent among those histories who are exclusively materialistic, sociologistic, or idealistic in their assumptions. So there you go. So rather than choosing one of the three, material, social, and spiritual, you afford all of them. They all have their own place. It's beautiful. Now, there's kind of a problem here. This recognition signals at least a partial elimination of the exclusively rational interpretation, and thus it shows evidence of an irrational character. It makes possible not only a systematic view of phenomena, but also a systatic, structural, indeterminate, and hence aperspectival perception, wherein a systatic element, that of interdependency, is in the forefront. So the reason why I think he says it's a partial supersession is, one, we went from, of course, with the mental we know it's one or the other, but now we've gone from 2 to 3. That mirrors the switch from logic to threefold logic. It's good, but we haven't quite gotten out of there yet. And 3, you're insisting to me that I have to take these 3 seriously. I guess that's fine, but there are probably other things as well that I could also integrate, so I'm going to do that too. So it's a little bit of a mix of both. Incidentally, Martin Buber may have aimed at something similar in 1923, yet as a consequence of his mental rational limitations, it was expressed only fragmentarily in his definition of the unified ego. In the lived reality, there is unification with the soul, the gathering of powers in the core, the decisive moment of man. This gathering does not regard the instincts as too impure, the senses as too peripheral, the disposition as too evanescent. Everything must be incorporated and mastered. Beautifully said. Our consciousness structuration has shown a parallel form of realization between the multifariously structured consciousness and its anchorage in man as a whole. Inherent in the structuration is the impossibility for individual consciousness structures to determine one another. In their superimposition, they overdetermine each other. Hence, the psychic overdetermines the vital, the mental overdetermines the psychic, while the overdetermination occurs integratively in the integral consciousness structure. And thus, the potential element inherent in each individual structure becomes visible. We have already stressed that in the structuration is not a system or a schema. Rather, it makes the visible the interconnection. So as the mental structure will say, as that's added into this sort of integral pot, well, because it interjects all this new mental stuff as opposed to the mental and magical stuff, well, what's happened? The differences are now brought into light. It's pretty cool. So again, the point is they all work together in a nice integral whole. The perception of interconnections presupposes the presence of the temporal aspect, just as each structure is realizable spatio-temporally, that is, four-dimensionally. And inasmuch as Husserl has already emphasized the perception of interconnections, thus irrationally superseding rational fixity and rigidity, it is significant that we can ascertain an emphasis on the quote-unquote grasping of interconnections in philosophical sociology. So rather than, of course, with phenomenology, we've already covered this, but it's always good to have refreshers, rather than just saying, rather than doing the traditional rational thing, my mouse pad is either black or it's not. phenomenology and transcendental logic say, well, what are the conditions necessary for me to even posit the question, let alone get an actual answer? So what are the interconnections? That's exactly what Gebser's doing, right? The interconnections between direction, space, objectified space, perspectivity, tools, all that stuff. That's really what he's talking about. Now, that same process is happening sociologically. And proceeding from his deliberations on the acausal nature of the qualitative, Guardini stresses the, quote, essential interconnections and conceives of them, not in Husserl's sense, but as a unification of causally non-determinable phenomena. Even political economics in its own reduced field speaks of the necessity to recall the quote-unquote total interconnections when dealing with organizational systems, and to consider the entire person inclusive of his vital instincts and psychic components. Beautifully said, economists. You guys have to get back in the world. All right, you guys make... some of these economic plans they're not made for human beings. They're made for chess pieces, which we are not. For example, when the government decides that they want to raise a tax from 38% to 43%, let's say, all things being equal, and no one changes any of their behavior in response to the new taxes, right? Let's say it'll increase. We're projected to have a surplus of $1 billion. It's going to bring in an extra $1 billion in revenue. Great. Here's the problem. When people see the increase, they psychologically respond to that increase. So what they do is they change their behavior, and maybe they'll be a little more frugal, a little more austere. This happens all the time. So instead of earning $1 billion, you lose $1 billion. I remember my home state of Maryland did this exact same thing. They were stupidly listened to idiots like Bernie Sanders and said, well, you can just increase taxes pretty much without any sort of thought about how this might affect people. You increase from 20 to 70 to 80, like AOC says. What they did is they expected to bring in hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue so they could fund their programs. They lost over $300 million of precious tax revenue because everyone just moved. Why wouldn't they? Of course they would. It's ridiculous. So yes, economics is finally starting to integrate the psychology of man when devising their little economic plans. All right? It's beautiful. Let's see. I think we're going to skip, actually. I don't think we need this. There's a part in here where he actually talks about feminism, and he says that the medieval church denied woman her soul, which is patriarchy, of course. And it's so obvious to see why that would be the case. I mean, when you seriously implement things like chastity belts and dowries and all this insane stuff. I mean, you can't go outside without your dad's permission or your husband's permission. You can't show any sort of of your body, cleavage, or even just like legs, like your calves. I mean, come on, you're restraining women's soul, and I think that's wrong. I know it's pretty popular nowadays amongst the far right to say, well, essentially because men can physically dominate women, therefore we should. You're essentially what they're saying is because the yin can physically dominate the yang, it should. How do you think that's gonna? When you turn the yin and the yang into opposites that are antithetical, and we're no longer friends in this sort of game of polar complementarity, and now we're enemies in this game of antithetical dualism, you're going to see problems. Now, here is the problem, though, and there is something, and maybe this is a bit controversial. Say what you will about the patriarchal way of doing things, there was balance. Now, I agree, again, I do agree with Gebser that it does restrain women's soul, and I do think that is obviously a problem, and we should work to stop that. Here's the problem. There's a shift. Remember the integral shift from left to right and right to left. There's a balance now. So when the man comes home, rather than having a partner who cooks some food and does all the stereotypical trad wife stuff, now he's coming home to another earner, which is to say to another competitor. And now they have to compete about who engages in the unpaid labor to protect the others. Now there's a they've thrown off the balance. And I think that's a big problem with our modern dating. I think we've struggled to adapt to this new way of doing things. I think what it really has come down to is men are really put And there's a lot of pressure to put on men to split household chores and sort of do that. But you don't really see the same for women. Women, it's go be a boss bitch, go make money. Screw your husband. He's not working. He's not living your life for you. I just think it's silly. But we do need to balance. There does need to be some degree of balance. We need to stop this competing stuff. I'm not against the idea necessarily of men being stay-at-home dads. I think a lot of time it signals a good a lack of ego, because you're putting your family first rather than the whims and the judges of some people who they're not going to help you pay your bills, right? They're not going to put food in your daughter's mouth. We just have to balance these things. I think there needs to be a little more respect going both ways, but we don't see that nowadays. We see men being resentful at women kind of assuming their place, and men believe in some ways they're able to do it. Like, obviously you can go work a job, but in some ways, traditional masculinity, there are a lot of good things to it. There are a lot of bad things to it, but I'm kind of rambling now. Let's continue. Let's see. Okay, this is cool. A different aspect of the emergent openness has been indicated by J.A. Schumpeter, who observes that during the course of the last generation, the public has gradually assumed the place of the patron in support of intellectuals. This means that those engaged in mental work are no longer dependent on patriarchy, but face an open world, indeed are for the first time part of the general public. So what that means, this one little paragraph, by the way, inspired my Substack about Thomas Sowell, Jean Gebser, and the betrayal of the intelligentsia. So what's happening on a broader sociological level is, remember, we know the mental rational way of doing things, right? You set things as static, they are permanent, they are set, and then you create these sort of hierarchies, because you're constantly pitting something against each other and privileging one or the other. Hierarchies just naturally flow from that. So what's happening is all of our set natural law, all of our set hierarchies, socially, politically, whatever, that are based on natural law and all this stuff, they're all being undone. They're all coming apart because they're all being set into motion by the new consciousness structure. And nowhere is that more evident than intellectuals. So intellectuals, they used to have a very high esteemed place in this set objective hierarchy, right? They were funded by, let's say, the Medici family, this sort of powerful institution, patriarch, matriarch, whatever you want to call it. And they would fund them, and they would sort of be above. They would hang out with the elite, the clergy, the aristocrats. They would be above the common folk who couldn't even understand what they were saying. Because, of course, back then, media was not as ubiquitous as it is today. If you had access to books and you could read, that's saying something. That means you had a certain degree of privilege. So what happens, right, after the traditional rational ordering and after the beneficiaries and the Medicis of the world, after that gets cut, now the intellectuals have to look back at those people who they used to sneer at and they used to look down upon. Now they're looking up at them, because without them, they can't do their intellectual work. So I think there's an extreme resentment that fuels the betrayal of the intelligentsia that we've seen since the 20th century. To be clear, the intelligentsia supported anti-white racism now, and they supported anti-black racism 100 years ago when this ridiculous eugenic scientist crap was going on that gave rise to the Hitlers of the world. That was the academia that was pushing. That wasn't us. That was you. So that's what happens, and that's why I think the intellectual class has behaved so badly. There's been a fundamental psychological shift that they have not adapted to, and it breeds resentment. I think they resent, and also another problem is, as capitalism, as liberalism afforded the common man the ability to express his skills, intelligence, human capital, essentially, I think the intelligentsia had a real ego hit when they realized that the Wright brothers, will say, they were very bright people, and they did not go through the academic little credential system. They weren't sitting doing purely abstract stuff. They weren't talking about Heidegger.